Good morning and welcome. I'm Ani Packer, the inaugural Executive Director of Visionary Women. At Visionary Women, our aim is to elevate the voices of women and girls locally here in Los Angeles, nationally, and internationally. We do this by providing direct grant opportunities to organizations that support women and girls, host in-person and online events, and offer mentorship opportunities across all sectors. If you are an organization or an individual looking to learn more about our impact, please visit us at visionarywomen.com. Thank you so much for all of you for joining us today for this critically important and timely conversation around the social unrest that ignited in Iran in early October, as the women of Iran fight for parity within their society. The voices of the Iranian women have reverberated throughout every corner of the globe, and what we're experiencing is truly a historic moment in time. I'm certain we're all going to learn a great deal from our distinguished panel of guests, all of whom are visionary women in their own right. Before we jump right in, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Nilu Razi.
Ani, thank you so much. And I really want to thank everyone at Visionary Women for allowing us to have this very important conversation. And I'm thrilled to have joining us today, the Honorable Goli Ameri and the incredible Lisa Daftari to have this conversation. Let me tell you just a couple of quick things about these incredible women. Goli is an Iranian-American businesswoman and former US diplomat. She has had a number of incredible roles in the government, which make her perfectly situated to have this conversation, including serving as the Undersecretary General for the Humanitarian Values and Diplomacy for the International Federation of the Red Cross, as U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Education and Cultural Affairs, as well as a U.S. representative to the United Nations. Lisa is an investigative journalist who focuses on foreign affairs with a specialization in Middle Eastern policy. She's an on-air Fox News political analyst and is the editor-in-chief of the Foreign Desk. And I'm really thrilled to have both of you joining us for this conversation. I want to tell everyone who has joined us that we will, at the end of this conversation, be open for Q&A. So as we speak, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And we will hopefully have time to at least turn into a few of these questions. Just to set the context, for the past 7 weeks, we've witnessed Iranians, young Iranians, led by women and students, rise up in protests against the morality laws, against the Iranian regime, and really against the very harsh reality of their everyday existence. These protests were sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini, a young Kurdish Iranian woman who died in detention. And they're unprecedented, both in scale, in duration, and in unity. Iranians from different ethnic and religious backgrounds are taking part. They're defying government threats and doing so with very real risk to themselves. These courageous protesters have adopted the Kurdish slogan, "Woman, Life, Freedom," as their rallying cry. And they're taking to the streets to demand political freedom in the face of internet blackouts, mass arrests, and live fire attacks by security services. Of course, men have also participated in large numbers, and they're doing it in the name of Amini and by embracing feminist rhetoric. The protests are widespread. They've risen above ethnic and geographic boundaries throughout the country, and the international community is paying close attention. Last week, the US government announced new sanctions against 14 individuals, Iranians, it's holding responsible for repression and abuse in these protests. And the Iranian government is paying attention. This week, Iran's judiciary announced that it's going to hold public trials for 2,000 people who've been detained during these protests, 1,000 in Tehran and 1,000 outside of Tehran. The last time Iran saw protests on this scale was after the 2009 elections between reformist candidate Mossavi and then President Ahmadinejad. In 2009, the government crackdown was swift. Security forces opened fire on crowds. They killed dozens. They detained thousands. And opposition candidates were put under house arrest, essentially decapitating the movement, which eventually died down. Today, while there's no clear figures, we know hundreds of Iranians have been killed, including children, and thousands upon thousands have been detained. And while the protests have become more regular in Iran over the years, the question we're going to unpack today during this conversation is whether this one is going to be different. So Lisa, I would love to start with you. Can you give us a quick history of this movement? How did it start? How is it building?
Thank you, Nilu. Thank you for having us. And I'm honored to be part of this panel with Goli and to have all of you. I'm so sorry, I'm feeling a little bit under the weather. My son kept me up all night last night with a cold that he's battling, and it looks like he gave it to me as well. But we will plow through, and it's so special today. For 7 weeks we've been talking about these protests, but today to do so for a platform that is focused on giving women a voice, looking to the future, having a vision for women and what their role will be in the future, and looking at a population of Iranian women who will, in fact, dictate the future of not only their country, but I am certain that it will be for the entire region, if not for the whole world. They are setting the tone. For the last 7 weeks, we have seen protests in Iran that, of course, the catalyst of which was the killing of the 22-year-old Mahsa Amini for just showing a little bit of hair. And of course, this story in the scheme of 43 years of persecution under this regime was the perfect proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, because the entire world can understand how ludicrous it is for a 22-year-old woman to be killed for merely showing a bit of her hair. And now when the young people of Iran come out onto the streets and say, all we want are our basic freedoms, it's understandable what they're talking about. So each time in the last 43 years that we have seen protests on the streets of Iran, the catalyst has been different. This time it was Mahsa Amini. We've seen previous protests with it was called the egg protest, or the protest of 2009, which was over the fraudulent election. Or we saw Bazari protests led by the entrepreneurs in the bazaars, or the teachers' protests, or the retirees. Each time the catalyst was different, but if we were looking closely enough, the message on the streets was always the same. It was death to the dictator. But this time around, it's different. And it's different because of many of the things Nilu mentioned. It is unified, both inside and outside Iran. We have never seen such unity in the messaging, and the message being very simple: regime change. And when people ask, who's the leader? What will happen? How about the future? Iranians aren't worried about that. Their main goal and only goal is to get rid of this regime. And you can tell by their slogans that are becoming increasingly their messages are becoming increasingly harsh and calling for, obviously, death, using profanity even to get their message across, to get some international attention on their movement. Of course, the women are at the helm of this, but of course, they're not alone. The men are joining them on the streets. And it's not just in Tehran. In 2009, the media portrayed this as the cool kids of Tehran out on the streets protesting. It's all throughout the country. When you're seeing protests in cities like Qom, which is a clerical city, typically many religious scholars there, many madrasas there that are more of the lower socioeconomic brackets, the religious brackets. Now you're seeing protests on the streets of these places as well. So it tells us that it's extremely widespread. It has lasted for 7 weeks, despite the brutal crackdowns. They are not scared. The regime is trying to send a message. They're trying to scare these kids. They're trying to make examples out of influencers, people who have large followings, people who have names out there in all sorts of sectors of athletes and musicians and poets and dancers. But the kids are not scared. They are not backing down. And that tells us that this movement is not going anywhere anytime soon. If there was ever a chance for the Iranian people to overthrow their government and to get their point across within the last 43 years, this looks like it will be it.
That's fantastic. I'm wondering if we can unpack the issues for Iranian women specifically, because they are really young Iranian women are at the forefront, and we've seen the government crack down on women's rights from the beginning, but especially over the past few years. Goli, I'm wondering if you can turn into this, the underlying issues and especially the underlying issues for women. What's at stake?
Thank you very much for that question. Thank you for having us. Thank you to Visionary Women. Nilu, it's wonderful to have you moderate this session. I actually wanted to add one other thing to the very, very important points that Lisa raised about why this movement is different. In 2009, I think we have to remember the historical context. This was right after Iraq. And I think one of the reasons why people in Iran were not necessarily directly calling for regime change as they are calling for it today is because there was some very real palpable concerns about internal instability in Iran, similar to what Iraq had experienced. And of course, you know, the Iranian regime took advantage to that to the hilt. And even to this day, I just read the other day that one of the Revolutionary Guards leaders had come out and say, if you don't like the Basij or if you don't like the Revolutionary Guards, for all the girls who are removing their scarves, you will be subject to the same kind of fate that the Yazidis had in Iraq. So I think we really need to remember that. The second item is that, you know, President Obama decided to remain quiet in 2009 with regards to the protest, which in my humble opinion was not a great idea. And he was gracious enough to come out recently and talk about the fact that they made a mistake. And I think, you know, when you have protesters in a country like Iran that is so restrictive, you know, you really need to help put wind in their sail. And that's one of the things that I want to talk about later on today. So let's get back to your question on women. I think many of us on this call who are of Iranian heritage clearly understand what is happening with the women of Iran, but I find myself having to explain that to my other friends. You know, with all due respect to all of the neighboring countries around Iran, Iran is not like many of the neighboring countries. You know, Iran had a constitutional revolution in 1905. Iranians have been looking for freedom and democracy since 1905. So this is not new to them. In addition, the women's movement that happened globally all over the world, and as we are very familiar with in the United States in the 60s, happened in Iran. You know, I, like many of you, had two sets of grandmothers, one of which, even in the 1930s, when the veil was banned, couldn't wait to get rid of her hijab and her veil, and another grandmother who, until the day that she died, wore the veil. It was a choice, and that's how the women liked it. So in the 60s, our mothers, many of our mothers of my generation, raised us, and people like myself who are in Iran raised their daughters, and then they have raised their daughters. So it's not like this women's movement stopped in Iran because an Islamic Republic came to power. The women's movement has been alive and well. In fact, if there's been one thorn in the side of the mullahs and the regime in Iran, has been the Iranian women. I also want to mention two things demographically about Iranian women. First of all, another reason why Iran is not like its neighboring countries is it has a 98% literacy rate. Almost 40% of Iranians have some level of higher education. The majority of university graduates in Iran are women. So, you know, when you put all of these elements together, I think it becomes much easier to understand why Iran is where it is today.
How united is the Iranian government? Is there a break between the hardliners and the slightly less hardliners when it comes to these protests? Or is the government united in terms of its response? Either one of you can take this one.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, right now it's just about survival. The regime as a whole and their tentacles abroad, by the way. I think it's sometimes difficult for Westerners to understand that the regime has such a broad network of individuals here in the United States who speak perfect English. Some of them are more American than Iranian. Some of them aren't even Iranian that are on the payroll of the Iran regime out to do their dirty work. All of those individuals, including the ones that are here in the United States, the ones that are in Europe, the ones that are in Iran, their sole goal, especially right now, is to stay in power. So we've seen, while the opposition has become much more united in their goal in overthrowing the regime, regardless of where they are in their vision of what the future of Iran should be or what their political affinities have been over the last 43 years, they've become more united. And the regime itself, again, just for the sake of survival, has become extremely united in that sense. Before this happened, this last round of protests, I should say before the 2019 protests, we were seeing actual rifts within the government in the aftermath of the 2009 protests. The 2009 protests were over a fraudulent election. It was the reformists and the hardliners. After that, the question of who would succeed the supreme leader came into focus, and because of that, we saw a lot of division within the government. Now it's a matter of survival. Will they be here tomorrow or not? And for that reason, we're seeing a lot of unity. To also go back to what Goli said, just to want to paint a little bit of a picture about the legal system in Iran with regards to women. This is the most astounding thing you'll hear about women in Iran. The value of women in the legal realm is half that of a man. Meaning, if you have a car accident and you have a woman as a witness, her eyes, what she saw, is worth half of what a man saw. So you'd need two female witnesses to balance out one male witness. If you cannot petition for a divorce on your own, and if you do so, it would have to be with many stipulations, and then the full custody of the children will go to the husband. There are many laws like this, as Goli painted the picture of what Iranian women are like, and the astounding statistics of what they are like and how they live, and their level of education and literacy. Just juxtapose that with a medieval, legal code that is supposed to, they're supposed to live under. It just does not match. And a lot of people say, "Wow, it's amazing what they've been, able to do in the last 7 weeks." And my reaction is, it's astonishing to me that it took this long. I'm also an Iranian woman, very much like Goli. We're informed and inspired so much by our female role models. I myself was born and raised in the United States, but obviously speak Farsi, read and write Farsi, and have a great connection to my homeland. But it's amazing for me to see my grandmother even worked as a teacher in Iran, and how powerful she was. And then to see my mother go to university, and to see her photos in the 70s of how she used to dress and live and have so much freedom. I mean, that inspires me. And I can only imagine if I were on the ground in Iran, living under this repression, how much I would be inspired to get back what my mother, my grandmother, and all the women before them lost in the last 43 years.
It's amazing in the face of these protests and the crackdowns, seeing the images on social media of women sitting around without their headscarves, eating lunch, just hanging out, and really embracing the idea that it's the end. Like, it's going to change. We're not going to go back to the way it was before. How does that happen? Are there leaders emerging? I mean, the Iranian government is so good at decapitating leaders and making sure that leaders don't emerge. How does a movement like this take hold and ultimately become successful if there can't be leadership, or can there be leadership?
Right. And, Neela, that's kind of the $1 million question right now, which I'm sure the US government, along with all the other democratic governments all over the world, are thinking about. And honestly, I think that the brain trust of the diaspora could probably have some thoughts that they could add to this discussion. But going back to your question, the Revolutionary Guards were set up exactly for this purpose. They were established for this purpose of the what if day. What if someday the people start protesting and it turns into a national revolution? How can we stop it? This is how this is why they were set up. And the Revolutionary Guards are incredibly powerful. There are reports that they actually own almost 80% of trade and industry in Iran. There is a lot of money that is going into their pockets, and that money is what's being used to pay the Basij on the streets and their members. And I don't know whether this is accurate or not, but there was some kind of a document on social media the other day about them actually hiring 9,000 proxy fighters, from Hamas and Hezbollah and Syria, et cetera, et cetera. So task number one, when it comes to global governments wanting to help the Iranian people, is to make sure that the source of funding for the IRGC is choked off. Because if that source of funding is not choked off, there is brutality, they have the will, and they have the power to put people down and basically, snuff out these protests.
What are the broader implications? I mean, when you look at the status of women in the Middle East in general, especially neighbors to the east of Iran, it's not great. Is there a possibility of spillover effect, regardless of where this goes, of this women's movement, which is really what this is, having a broader impact in the Middle East? And by the way, are other countries watching and nervous about what's happening in Iran, and how could that impact? That's a question that just came in, so I'm just going to pull it off the Q&A.
Yeah.
Could the response be a regional response?
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is something that's a great question. And I'm so glad somebody raised this point, because what the international community has to understand as they sit there and say, should we support them? Shouldn't we support them? Should we support them? Shouldn't we support them? They have to understand, as goes Iran, so will go the rest of the Middle East, and it will trickle into everywhere else in the world. And I'll give you some examples. In 1979, we had the Iran Revolution. Iran started putting money into Hezbollah, its proxy in Lebanon and other places in the Middle East to do their dirty work. So we saw the emergence of Al-Qaeda as another proxy by Saudi Arabia to combat that threat. And we saw all of these terrorist proxies sprout up throughout the Middle East. That basically painted the landscape of, I'm so sorry, my throat is killing me, but I'm going to plow through.
Trying.
These toddler colds are the worst. So they basically, this trickled through the Middle East, and it set the stage for the last 40 years of what we talk about in terms of insurgencies, proxy wars, and terrorism throughout the world, particularly starting with the Middle East and the funding of these terror groups by the Iran regime. In 2010, we saw the Arab Spring, and everyone asks, did the Arab Spring set the stage? And my answer is always, it wasn't the Arab Spring in 2010 that set the stage. It was the Green Revolution of 2009 that taught the Arab Spring what to do. The children that came out onto the streets for 2010 in those Arab countries. Because in 2009, we saw the Twitter revolution, which is the other name for the Green Revolution, where these young people in Iran took to the streets. And again, it started out the fraudulent election. Maybe they were, it wasn't presented as a call for regime change. But if you followed the slogans on the street, by the end, they were saying, Obama, are you with them or are you with us? They were saying death to the dictator. It did come out that it is also a call for regime change. What started out as, you know what, this whole system is corrupt, but we are also asking to just topple the entire regime. And of course, it wasn't covered as such by Western media outlets, as is often the case. 2010, we saw the Arab Spring. We saw the rise of young, modern, educated, progressive Arab young people come out onto the streets, and that became their movement. And of course, some of those countries were changed for the better, some for the worse. But Iran's different. It has a different landscape. And right now, the point I'm trying to make is that if this is a successful revolution, as we hope it will be, this will follow and hopefully join with the progressive Arab states of the region that, for example, signed on to the Abraham Accords. We saw Arab nations that you would never think before, not because they all of a sudden overnight became Zionists and decided to fuse up with Israel. It's because they decided that they would rather look to the future and look to prosperity rather than pine over the past and be victims for the rest of their lives. So they went forward. So you saw countries like Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan and the United Arab Emirates join with Israel. They're doing very impactful and meaningful business deals with Israel. And the Iranian people can have a piece of that. And they can join on. And they've talked about the Cyrus Accords. Victoria Coates, who has served our government and is working at a think tank now in Washington, D.C. She's the author of this term, the Cyrus Accords. That could be another prosperity plan between Iran's future, the people of Iran, and those nations that we saw sign on to the Abraham Accords. So the entire patchwork of the Middle East will completely change if there should be a different regime. We're talking about a cutting off of not just the Revolutionary Guard, which Goli mentioned, but cutting off funding for all of these terror organizations. Think about a world in which the Houthis in Yemen are not supported, in which Palestinian Islamic Jihad doesn't have funding, in which Hamas has not sent weapons to kill Israelis in Gaza, in which you don't have Hezbollah as a cancerous sore in Lebanon. I mean, the list goes on. There are are so many reasons for the Western world and the European nations and the United States to support this movement that I can't think of one reason not to, and to keep this regime in place.
Nilu, if I may add a couple of points here, Lisa made so many good points that I think it pretty much summarizes the landscape. But I just wanted to point to a couple of points that you raised. One is, oftentimes this movement is called a leaderless revolution or a leaderless protest. And somehow, I guess historically, people have come to believe that every single uprising or protest or revolution necessarily needs one charismatic leader. I'm not so sure I personally agree with that. And I just wanted to put forward the example of Tunisia, which is one of the countries that actually came out relatively whole after the Arab Spring uprisings. And one of the reasons was that Tunisia was on the brink of civil war. And what ended up happening was that this quartet of four, labor unions, trade and industry, human rights organizations, and the Lawyers Guild came together, and they essentially created a new constitution and a new form of government for Tunisia, and they actually won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2015. So there are other ways of looking at the protests that are happening in Iran, and essentially what it needs is some courage on the part of global governments, especially democratic governments, because the world is in a bit of a disarray now. Economically, there's inflation, there's the Russia-Ukraine war. The leaders are trying to figure out exactly how to deal with all of this. But I think essentially, if I'm hearing Lisa correctly, what we're saying is that what's happening in Iran is an unexpected gift. Yes, it's hard. Yes, it's messy. But in many ways, when Russia is busy dealing with its ineptitudes in the Ukraine, and now that Iran is actually involved in the war in the Ukraine, this is actually a gift that, if handled well, could end up with all the wonderful things that Lisa just mentioned.
I'd love to unpack this a little bit further, because there's some dynamics that are similar to perhaps what happened in Tunisia. You had a 2006 revolution in Nepal. You had the Algerian protests of 2019, 2020. And then there's some dynamics that are different. And as you said, Goli, the IRGC, the amount of money it has, the ability it has to bring in basically militia, non-Iranian militia, and pay them to quiet down protests, makes it also a little bit different from perhaps what's happened in other Arab countries. And if you look over time, you have major revolutions, you have coups, sometimes done by the military, and then you have grassroots protests that either lead to some amount of social change, but not regime change, and very rarely lead to regime change. Is the path here, from your perspective, a path to revolution, to coup, or is this a grassroots protest that ultimately can rise to regime change? And what would it take, given the specific dynamics in Iran?
I think this started out as option C, which is protests leading to a revolution, and now we're at option A. This is, in fact, a revolution. The reason I say that is because if you look at the crackdowns, and these videos are horrific to watch. They are absolutely horrific to watch. You won't see this in any other place on earth right now, when you have a government that doesn't, that's not there to protect its people. I saw a very interesting meme that said, look at a society, speaking of Iran right now, in which the hackers are with the people and then the police is against the people. You watch these, 10 police, or I shouldn't even call them police, they're thugs of the regime that are beating one woman on the ground. I mean, they're very difficult to watch, but for every one of those videos, you have videos of the bravery of the people. And it just illustrates that there's no turning back right now. There is no rewinding. There is no sitting at home for these people. Imagine, despite what you may see, for those who are non-Iranian, and many are Iranian, you can explain this to your friends. What you see on television, what you hear, after the Iran Revolution of 1979, this government, the regime, got involved in the Iran-Iraq war as a distraction to get people to rally around the flag. So Iranian people had to send their children off to war, and then they would reward them with, monthly checks if they lost their child and call them martyrs, shaheed. And with that, they fooled people into thinking that they were, with the government, that they were special and now protected by the government. And that's how they brought in their own level of constituents. And, now it's, this is not a society that wants to be martyred. So imagine these modern families that are sending out their children to protest and they don't come back, or a young girl who's 16 years old and in high school and refuses to sing the regime anthem and is killed. And this is the level of bravery, and they send their children out the next day knowing that those are the risks. So we are in fact in a revolution, and to the point where there is no leader. I just want to address this. This is probably the best aspect of this, and this is why I think they actually do have a chance this time around, is because there is no leader. I know that sounds completely inverted, but because there's no leader, this movement has a pure narrative. There is no division among those who are out on the streets, and there's no division among us who are out here trying to get their voices heard. There's no agenda to push one candidate ahead of the other. There's no agenda to bring in one type of government or one political philosophy over the other. And for that reason, I think that this is, and for the second reason I should add, is that it remains in the hands of those on the streets. The future is theirs. And because there is no leader, because there is no agenda, because there is no push for one political philosophy over the other, again, it belongs to the future belongs to those who are out on the streets. This is what Reza Pahlavi said. This is what many people who are in the forefront are looked upon as potential leaders or actual potential just voices that are looked at for direction and guidance in this realm. They're the ones who are saying if the future belongs to those kids. And I think that is why they have the best chance that they've ever had for a revolution. Of course, this will not be overnight. This is a marathon more than a sprint, as it has been said. It will take many more. And if this is not the ultimate step that will topple this regime, I do believe this will be the penultimate step that will in fact topple this regime.
And I actually wanted to build on something that Lisa just said, because I certainly agree with a lot of her points, especially the last one. But clearly, this is one of those situations where we can't be naive. I mean, uprising, protests, revolutions, they're messy. Unfortunately, they are messy. And there's going to be internal strife, and the Revolutionary Guards, who were established exactly for this reason, are not going to let go easily. So I think we have to bear that in mind and try to figure out, how do we deal with that? The other point I wanted to raise, which I think is really important in terms of US foreign policy, and in fact, global foreign policy, is one of the fundamental tenets of good foreign policy is first do no harm. It's just like medicine, first do no harm. So what this means is that the Iranian people are not looking for intervention. The Iranian people are not looking for physical intervention. They're looking for solidarity. And there are all sorts of really important critical ways of demonstrating solidarity. In addition, foreign governments should not be taking sides, particularly with organizations like the National Council of Resistance or the Mujahideen Khalq or the MEK, as they are called, because as many people know, they are despised in Iran. They have absolutely no standing. So this is really critical for us to put this word out there that job number one is to do no harm.
I want to I want to turn into this question of how does this revolution ultimately succeed? And we had a great question come in about this is a Gen Z revolution, and we all want to believe that with technology, with social media, we can sort of do revolution in a way that it's never been done before. And if you're a student of history and you look at the great revolutions of the modern world, whether it's the English Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, or the Russian Revolution, at some point the armed forces defect. And that becomes the turning point. And Goli, you raised this incredible point about the IRGC. The question I want to put out there is, do the security forces have to defect for this revolution to be successful?
They don't have to defect, but it would be wonderful if they did so. And that would be one way. There are many ways. That would be one way. And there are a long list of resources that they have internally and externally, more so externally, that they can offer these protesters. Look, they don't have guns. They don't have a way of organization. They hardly have any internet, and look what they have been able to accomplish thus far. They have killed several of these guards that come into places. The guards are actually fearful in certain places to go among the crowds because they are outnumbered. But as Goli said, they will do anything to stay in power. So it will become a bloodbath, and we have to expect that that's the way it will go. But it's providing them with the proper resources so that they can do it themselves. When Rob Malley, the envoy, the U.S. envoy, who's been entrusted with getting back into the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, comes out in the first couple of weeks of this movement and says, we are not pursuing a policy of regime change, that's harmful. That is getting in the way of the messaging from Iran, and that gives the mullahs a lot of breathing space to be like, you know what, we're good, because the United States and the European nations are not looking to take us out. But the Iranians came out, whether it was on Twitter or otherwise, and said, you know what, we don't care what you think, Rob Malley. And a petition started circulating here in the United States to remove him as envoy. Since then, I'm happy to report that in the last 7 weeks, the Iranian people, what they have been able to accomplish on their own has genuinely moved leaders in Europe and the United States to move their policy and to change and to pivot from this policy of very, very aggressively pursuing the JCPOA to saying right now it's not a go, which is a win. It's a win if they're not moving forward with it. And, the Iranian people were calling them out on their lip service. You cannot say we support the protests in Iran, we condemn the brutality, but on the other hand, be at the negotiating table with the mullahs and ready to give them all of this money. Another point that has been circulating in the United States, particularly in Washington, is to give this money that they are perhaps very eager to give back to the Iranian regime, find a way to give that money to those who will strike and not be able to work and need to get paid. Give the money to the Iranian people so that they can afford to go back out onto the streets and not go to work. Again, there are many, many resources, and it will require some of these resources. But as Goli said, the first step is to not get in the way, step away from the Iran nuclear deal, put those very, very targeted sanctions on the proper segments of Iran's weapons program, their IRGC, put those the Revolutionary Guard on the terror list. Canada has to do it. The United States did it. Europe is kind of flirting with the idea, and they have to do it sooner rather than later. I don't know what's taking such a long time. There are in fact terrorists. They should be put on terror lists. But these are the very minimal and diplomatic steps that the West can take to support this movement and to give these kids a chance.
May I make a couple of points about the U.S. foreign policy that Lisa was just referring to?
Please, yes.
I think personally, when I've thought about U.S. foreign policy on Iran in the last couple of decades, I think one of the biggest problems I have seen about it is that it's been very partisan rather than fact-based on what's happening on the ground. So you have the Republicans on the right that are, we're promoting regime change, probably with, physical intervention. And then you have Democrats on the left that are trying to make friends with a country whose one of its pillars is anti-Americanism. So sort of this middle ground, which in my humble opinion is usually what works best. And in fact, pretty much everything good that has happened in the United States has been on a bipartisan basis, that was shoved off the window. In addition, in terms of expertise on Iran, you have whether it's within the US government, whether it's with think tanks in Washington, essentially you have people that have a very bookish knowledge on Iran, whether they're in intelligence or whether they're, trying to make policy. They don't speak the language, they're not culturally familiar with Iran, they've never been there. And, and as we all know, as some of us who come from that heritage know, there are very defined nuances about the Iranian culture. Like task number one, how do you negotiate with the mullah? I think most of us sort of who've had experience with that, we understand that, mullahs do not exactly have the highest reputation in that land in terms of being trustworthy. So there are some of these really critical nuances that have been missed, that I think this would be really a good time for this administration, which actually appears to be much more in the center than most, to start thinking about.
Well, I also want to add the media's role in all of this as well. And I think obviously it trickles from the White House. And as a matter of fact, I should add to what Goli said, the administration, particularly in the last 2 decades, has always basically played this ping pong game between bomb Iran or let them get the bomb, right, from the right and the left. And in 2005, I did my thesis documentary on underground democratic groups in Iran that are pushing for regime change. And I was invited to a subcommittee of Congress to present that as the third option, not bomb Iran, not let them get the bomb, but the third option would be to focus on the Iranian people and a grassroots movement that could potentially overthrow the regime, which is what we're talking about now. So these were not ideas that were ever popular in Washington. And of course, they're too nuanced and probably too complex to be covered by the media in a meaningful way. And what's interesting is that it has taken all this time, but now we see a lot of Iranians and many scholars, and in fact, a lot of lawmakers, both on the left and right, I have to say, that are coming around and understanding that, especially Democrats that were perhaps for the JCPOA, are understanding that that is not the best way, that's very detrimental to this movement and to the Iranian people, and they're pivoting and they're in fact coming around. But it still is going to take a long time and unfortunate, because we're in the 7th week of this protest, and you still need to educate lawmakers and then therefore the media to have an interest in this, to understand this, to cover it in a way that's meaningful, and to give the Iranian people a voice. And because of that, the citizen journalists that are coming out of Iran, not only do they have to do their work, but I know that a lot of the activists here are taking out billboards in Times Square or taking out a page in the New York Times, because they feel that they have to take it into their own hands to get the word out, because the mainstream media is failing at their job. The number one message, and I'll just stop at this, the number one message I get from Iranian people inside Iran, and I can, without exaggeration, this is about 300 or 400 of these a day, is do not leave us alone. And it's very meaningful. They do look to the West. They do want media coverage. They want their stories told. And if that's the least we can do, I think we all have social media pages. It's something we can do to give them a voice here.
So we will definitely come back to do not leave them alone, which I think is incredibly critical. Goli, you've served in the State Department. You've served with the UN. If you could define what the US policy should be today, with respect to Iran, if you could define what actions the UN should be taking, what would those be?
Right. Let me actually start with the UN. And honestly, I've served at the UN. My great uncle was at the UN. I have obviously tender feelings for the UN. Having said that, unfortunately, when you do serve at the UN, you realize the realities of the UN, which was essentially set up to, promote human rights and democracy, et cetera, but unfortunately, it's ended up defending governments rather than the people. So as such, I really, unfortunately, I'm not holding my breath on what the UN can do. I mean, gratitude goes to the United States and Albania for having this Security Council meeting this week to discuss, the repression in Iran. But am I holding my breath that the UN is going to actually establish a mechanism that's going to look into this? No. The UN Human Rights Council has to vote. The Commission has to vote on this. And it actually voted 17 to 19 against doing exactly the same thing for the Uyghurs in China with 11 abstentions. So they voted not even to debate it, let alone set up a mechanism. So I am not really holding much hope.
Goli, can they lose their seat on the Women's Committee?
Well, see, that in itself requires a vote. I mean,
that's crazy, right?
Everybody there are countries that have all sorts of different relationships with Iran, whether it's economic, whether it's political. I remember myself lobbying in the 3rd committee for the human rights record in Iran, and I can't tell you how difficult it was. It was, it really was incredibly difficult. So I think, I hope I'm wrong. Sincerely, I hope I'm wrong, but I'm not really holding up much hope for the UN. As far as the US is concerned, I think we've talked about some of the more practical things in terms of sanctions, but one of the things that I've been really thinking about, kind of inspired by what Giscard d'Estaing did in 1978, during the 1979 revolution, where he pulled together an international conference called the Guadalupe Conference, where, all the leaders, well, the 4 leaders of, Western European democracies got together, and essentially they decided that the Shah had lost the confidence of his people, so therefore they could no longer be supported. I think an international conference on Iran and its repression of its people is really critical for a number of these countries to come together. I mean, you just saw what Justin Trudeau said about, the change in regime in Iran. Coming together, discussing the facts on the ground, sending out a communique about how they, what the sentiment of these nations is about Iran, and, potentially taking a number of steps. How do you choke off the funding to the IRGC? How do you potentially freeze the assets of the Iranian leadership and their progeny in Western countries? How do you take away the residency permits of the progeny in Western countries? So these are just a handful of ideas. I'm sure there's smarter people out there that are already thinking about this, but I think a global conference that really puts the spotlight on Iran at this point in time would be really critical.
There's a lot of questions coming in from the audience about how we can more broadly support this movement. And of course, the complication is that there are sanctions on Iran. So it's not like Ukraine can send money into Ukraine. That can't happen here. But there are ways people can support, show solidarity, leave no one behind, as someone put into the chat. What are the specific things we can do, that this audience can do, to support women, to support this revolution?
Yeah, I think for right now, there are no ways. There's actually 4 or 5 banking ways to get money into Iran. 4 of them are a no-go. One of them is being investigated as a potential way, but don't give money. Don't buy into any of these links that are going.
Please do not violate U.S. sanctions or U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I just want to put that out there. We are not.
Yeah, you'd be not only violating sanctions, you'd also be duped, and it's a fraud. So for many reasons, you should not be doing that. But right now, the Iranian people, they want one thing from us, and that's to have their story told. As I said, when they say don't leave us alone, it's because they don't want to be doing this in vain. And the one thing we can do is to get the Western world's attention. Like Canada has pivoted, the United States has pivoted, the EU has pivoted. In the last 6 or 7 weeks alone, the emotional, these videos are so compelling that it has caused them to shift in their foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran, which is an incredible thing. And if we can have a part in that, each one of us has a social media platform, each of us have friends, we go out, we talk about it. If there is one person you can influence by teaching them or telling them or just getting the word out, just by attending or tuning into this Zoom call, share stories, share videos. I mean, whatever you see out there, it's a tremendous help to them. It's amazing how grateful the Iranian people are to us for telling their story. The outpouring is tremendous. And again, they're the ones on the front lines. The least we can do is to echo and amplify their voices and really tell their story in a capacity that they're not able to do so.
And Goli, how can we put, this concept of having a Guadalupe-like conference that pulls the world together to at least have unity from a global perspective in terms of response to Iran? What kind of pressure can we put on our government to do that, or other governments to do that and make something like that happen?
First of all, thank God that we all live in a free and democratic country with all of our challenges. That we actually have the ability to be able to influence our lawmakers, to influence administrations. I think that we should never, ever underestimate that. That is so important. So clearly picking up the phone and calling your congressional office, those things really matter. These people listen. The more Iranian Americans and friends of Iranian Americans and people that we meet, just like Lisa and Nilu just said, to educate them on the topic and have them reach out to members of Congress, that makes a difference. Right. Another idea that somebody, showed me a couple of weeks ago was potentially calling the White House hotline. The White House listens to
Yes.
citizen comments. And, that is an important avenue for people registering their ideas and their thoughts. Just talking about how these protests, as Lisa very eloquently highlighted at the beginning, are different. And that this is a gift. This is actually a gift to the Western world that might be a little difficult to unwrap, but it is a gift nevertheless.
There's been a lot of conversation about this, and not today here, but about the sanction economy and how despite sanctions, these governments that are under sanction can continue to, this question came in, can continue to buy military equipment, can continue to fund their security forces. Are we properly enforcing sanctions? Is there something else we need to do with respect to sanctions? Or the flip side of that is with respect to the nuclear deal?
I want to say something that's a continuation of what Goli said about partisan politics and dealing with Iran. The Iran issue should have been for 43 years a nonpartisan, bipartisan issue, because we're dealing with a group of terrorists that are leading 80 million plus people on the ground, and the people are telling us what's going on. So if we're not listening to them, we're siding with the terrorists, and it's a tremendous loss of opportunity, as Goli said, a gift. In terms of sanctions, we've ping-ponged back and forth between removing the sanctions, watering down the sanctions, and then properly enforcing them for a while as well. During the Trump administration, love him, hate him, the pressure campaign worked very well. We saw that because these sanctions were properly enforced in certain segments that were choking and attempting to choke the regime more than the people. Again, there will always be the side effect of sanctions on the people, especially with a regime that is hoping to put the economic burden on the people so that it can blame the big Satan, the United States, for enforcing those sanctions. They will do so. So there will always be that side effect of affecting the people. I don't ever want to diminish that. But in the case of sanctions, if they are properly enforced and enforced in a way that, again, focuses on certain segments that deal just with the regime, their weapons program, their cyber program, their Basij and Revolutionary Guards, etc., then they work very well. Another big confidence boost in this round of protests was the assassination or killing of Qasem Soleimani, who was the most I should say he was their best leader. I hate to put that positive spin on such a butcher, but he was the IRGC commander who, they had much confidence behind him because of his abilities, and he steered a lot of what was going on in Syria and inside the country. So, this ability to not get involved with boots on the ground, but to have a very clear line of fighting terrorists where we see them and not trying to appease them or shake hands with them or give them billions of dollars has gone a long way. And I hope that the current administration sees that and continues to pivot in a way that is meaningful, impactful, and it helps and assists the Iranian people with their endeavors.
I just want to remind, go ahead, Golizhan.
Just very quick point here. So in terms of the sanctions that Lisa was talking about, clearly there's still a tremendous amount of oil smuggling that's happening out of Iran. So that's one way to focus on. But I also wanted to talk about the UN one more time, because we talked about sanctions. So the UN Iran has never allowed the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights into Iran, but the person that they did allow into Iran was the Special Rapporteur on the impact of sanctions. So she went to Iran, wrote this big long report, and essentially one of her conclusions was that the sanctions have impacted the human rights situation in Iran. So we can read into that whatever we want, but that's kind of the political nature of the UN. But go ahead.
I was just going to say, we have 5 minutes late, and I just want to remind the audience, please throw comments or questions into the chat, and we'll try and get to them. There's one question that's come up a couple times, and I'm just going to put it out there. Depending on if the midterms change the balance of power in Washington, is that going to have an impact on what happens in terms of U.S. government response to the protests? Anyone?
I think, oh, Goli, do you want to answer? Absolutely, it will. Of course, Congress is going to have a big say, Senate as well. More so, I think Congress and the subcommittees of Congress. It's very important just to have voices out there that either understand or are advocates for the Iranian people. That's why, Goli's suggestion to call your congressional candidates, especially those of you who are in Los Angeles, because we're such a large constituency here, our voices matter. They're there to represent us. And if there's enough calls, they will, think twice about where they stand on important issues. And I do think the outcome of for many things, but I think foreign policy, will play a very important role in general in the midterms because of everything going on in the world, because of China's, march to expanding its power, because of North Korea and its flexing of its powers, and the Ukraine war, and of course what's going on in Iran. So I do think foreign policy will play a major role in the outcome that we will see next Tuesday.
Another question we got is, what's the tipping point? Are we already past the tipping point? Thoughts?
Oh, Goli, do you want to take that, or should I go again?
Honestly, I think I would be talking off the top of my head, because clearly I have no internal information about what all is happening in Iran. I think, as I said, this is not going to be pretty. It is going to be, unfortunately, messy. The Revolutionary Guards are not going to let go easily. It's not very clear, what the role of the army is, or what their proclivities are, or what kind of action they want to take. So I think I'm just going to say, I don't know.
I would say, I would point to two things. There was a weekend in which on Saturday, there was the fire at the Evin prison. So for those who aren't familiar, Evin prison is the most notorious brutal prison in Tehran. It's where a lot of scholars and professors and political opposition leaders and people who are there for a mere Facebook post are kept and often executed there as well, without their families knowing. That's a side point. That there was a fire at that prison. And it was in the wards where the newer detainees were brought in from the protest. So imagine a peaceful protester goes out onto the streets, gets thrown into this prison, and then dies in a fire because of the regime's brutality. The next day, they stormed Sharif University. Sharif University is like the Harvard or MIT of Iran, the best, brightest. The future of Iran are within the walls of that university and in the dorms. And there was a massacre there, basically. We still don't know the death toll exactly. And that was within the same weekend. And that's when, I did a lot of reporting on both of these incidents. And I said that was the tipping point, because we knew for 43 years that this regime does not care about its people, that this is not a representation of the people. But when you go after your best and brightest, you're killing off the future of your country. And when the Iranian people see that, and they had actually blocked off the road so that people couldn't even get to the fire at the prison, or they couldn't even get to the perimeter of the university to help these kids out of harm's way, it's unfathomable. I don't think that the Iranian protesters, the young people, their families, anybody who's on the ground who supports this movement is willing to look away from that and to go back. There's no going back. So I think, again, this will be a long-term fight. I don't think this is going to happen overnight, but I think we did pass the tipping point of where this is going. These are speculations, but I'm basing it on not just 6 or 7 weeks of reporting on this, but actually many years of researching the opposition inside Iran and interviewing many of its members and getting some sort of feel for where the people are at. That's my opinion.
Lisa, Goli, thank you both so much. I'm cognizant of time. Someone did ask the question whether this session is going to be shared, and the answer is yes. It will be put up on the Visionary Women website, and you can share it with your friends. The big takeaway here is, don't just sit back. There's a lot each of us can do to amplify the voices of the protesters, of the incredibly brave women, men, the students, the children who are protesting and demanding regime change. So thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Visionary Women, again, for hosting this conversation. And we all got our work cut out for us to support the people of Iran. Thank you.